The Truth of Masks by Oscar Wilde. A note on illusion. In many of the somewhat violent attacks that have recently been made on that splendor of mounting which now characterizes our Shakespearean revivals in England, it seems to have been tacitly assumed by the critics that Shakespeare himself was more or less indifferent to the costumes of his actors, and that could he see Mrs. Langtry's production of Antony and Cleopatra, he would probably say that the play and the play only is the thing, and that everything else is leather and prunella. While as regards any historical accuracy in dress, Lord Lytton, in an article on the 19th century, has laid it down as a dogma of art that archaeology is entirely out of place in the presentation of any of Shakespeare's plays, and the attempt to introduce it one of the stupidest pedantries of an age of prigs. Lord Lytton's position I shall examine later on, but as regards the theory that Shakespeare did not busy himself much about the costume wardrobe of his theatre, anybody who cares to study Shakespeare's methods will see that there is absolutely no dramatist of the French, English, or Athenian stage who relies so much for his illusionist effects on the dress of his actors as Shakespeare does himself. Knowing how the artistic temperament is always fascinated by beauty of costume, he constantly introduces into his plays masks and dances, purely for the sake of pleasure which they give the eye, and we have still his stage directions for the three great processions in Henry VIII, directions which are characterized by the most extraordinary elaborateness of detail, down to the collars of Essex and the pearls in Anne Boleyn's hair. Indeed, it would be quite easy for a modern manager to reproduce these pageants absolutely as Shakespeare had them designed, and so accurate were they that one of the court officials of the time, writing an account of the last performance of the play at the Globe Theatre to a friend, actually complains of their realistic character, notably of the production of the stage of the Knights of the Garter in the robes and insignia of the order as being calculated to bring ridicule on the real ceremonies. Much in the same spirit in which the French government some time ago prohibited that delightful actor M. Christian from appearing in uniform, on the plea that it was prejudicial to the glory of the army that a colonel should be caricatured. And elsewhere the gorgeousness of apparel, which distinguished the English stage under Shakespeare's influence, was attacked by the contemporary critics, not as a rule, however, on the grounds of the democratic tendencies of realism, but usually on those moral grounds, which are always the last refuge of people who have no sense of beauty. The point, however, which I wish to emphasize, is not that Shakespeare appreciated the value of lovely costumes and adding picturesqueness to poetry, but that he saw how important costume is as a means of producing certain dramatic effects. Many of his plays, such as Measure for Measure, Twelfth Night, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, All's Well That Ends Well, Cymbeline, and others, depend for their illusion on the character of the various dresses worn by the hero or the heroine. The delightful scene in Henry VI on the modern miracles of healing by faith loses all its point unless Gloucester is in black and scarlet, and the denouement of the Merry Wives of Windsor hinges on the color of Anne Page's gown. As for the uses Shakespeare makes of disguises, the instances are almost numberless. Posthumus hides his passion under a peasant's garb, and Edgar his pride beneath idiot's rags. Portia wears the apparel of a lawyer, and Rosalind is attired in all points as a man. The cloak-bag of Pisanio changes Imogen to the youth Fidele. Jessica flees from her father's house in boy's dress, and Julia ties up her yellow hair in fantastic love-knots and dons hose and doublet. Henry VIII woos his lady as a shepherd, and Romeo his as a pilgrim. Prince Hal and Point appear first as footpads in buckram suits, and then in white aprons and leather jerkins as the waiters in a tavern. And as for Falstaff, does he not come on as a highwayman, as an old woman, as Herne the Hunter, and as the clothes going to the laundry? Nor are the examples of the employment of costume as a mode of intensifying dramatic situations less numerous. After slaughter of Duncan, Macbeth appears in his nightgown as if roused from sleep. Timon ends in rags, the play he had begun in splendor. Richard flatters the London citizens in a suit of mean and shabby armor, and as soon as he has stepped in blood to the throne, marches through the streets in crown and George and Garter. The climax of the Tempest is reached when Prospero, throwing off his enchanter's robes, sends Ariel for his hat and rapier, and reveals himself as the great Italian duke. The very ghost in Hamlet changes his mystical apparel to produce different effects. And as for Juliet, a modern playwright would probably have laid her out in shroud and made the scene a scene of horror merely. But Shakespeare arrays her in rich and gorgeous raiment, whose loveliness makes the vault a feasting presence full of light, turns the tomb into a bridal chamber, and gives the cue and motive for Romeo's speech of the triumph of beauty over death. Even in small details of dress, such as the color of a major domo's stockings, the pattern on a wife's handkerchief, the sleeve of a young soldier, and a fashionable woman's bonnets, become in Shakespeare's hands points of actual dramatic importance, and by some of them the action of the play in question is conditioned absolutely. Many other dramatists have availed themselves of costume as a method of expressing directly to the audience the character of a person on his entrance, though hardly so brilliantly as Shakespeare has done in the case of the dandy Paroles, whose dress, by the way, only an archaeologist can understand. The fun of a master and servant exchanging coats in presence of the audience, of shipwrecked sailors squabbling over the division of a lot of fine clothes, and of a tinker dressed up like a duke while he is in his cups, may be regarded as part of that great career which costume has always played in comedy, from the time of Aristophanes down to Mr. Gilbert. But nobody from the mere details of apparel and adornment has ever drawn such irony of contrast, such immediate and tragic effect, such pity and such pathos as Shakespeare himself. Armed cap à pie, the dead king stalks on the battlements of Elsinore, because all is not right with Denmark. Shylock's Jewish gabardine is part of the stigma under which that wounded and embittered nature writhes. Arthur, begging for his life, can think of no better plea than the handkerchief he had given Hubert. "Have you the heart when your head did but ache? I knit my handkerchief above your brows. The best I had, a princess brought it to me, and I did never ask of you again." And Orlando's blood-stained napkin strikes the first sombre note, that exquisite woodland idyll, and shows us the depth of feeling that underlies Rosalind's fanciful wit and wilful jesting. "Last night 'twas on my arm I kissed it. I hope it be not gone to tell my lord that I kiss shot but he." That was supposed to be woman. Says Imogen, jesting on the loss of the bracelet, which was already on its way to Rome to rob her of her husband's faith. The little prince, passing the tower, plays with the dagger in his uncle's girdle. Duncan sends a ring to Lady Macbeth on the night of his own murder, and the ring of Portia turns the tragedy of the merchant into a wife's comedy. The great rebel York dies with a paper crown on his head. Hamlet's black suit is a kind of color motive in the piece, like the mourning of the Chimene in the Cid, and the climax of Antony's speech is the production of Caesar's cloak. "I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on. 'Twas on a summer evening in his tent, the day he overcame the navy. Look, in this place ran Cassius's dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. Kind souls, what weep you, when you but behold our Caesar's vesture wounded? The flowers which Ophelia carries with her in her madness are as pathetic as the violets in blossom on a grave. The effect of Lear's wandering on the heath is intensified beyond words by his fantastic attire, and when Cloten, strung by the thought of that simple simile which his sister draws from her husband's raiment, arrays himself in that husband's very garb to work upon her the deed of shame, we feel that there is nothing in the whole of modern French realism, nothing even in Thérèse Raquin, the masterpiece of horror, which, for terrible and tragic significance, can compare with this strange scene in Cymbeline. And the actual dialogue, also some of the most vivid passages, are those suggested by costume. Rosalind's, "Dost thou think, though I am caparisoned like a man, I have a doublet and hose in my disposition?" Constance's, "Grief fills the place of my absent child, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form," and the quick sharp cry of Elizabeth, "Ah, cut my lace asunder!" are only a few of the many examples one might quote. One of the finest effects I have ever seen on the stage was Salvini, in the last act of Lear, tearing the plume from Kent's cap and applying it to Cordelia's lips when he came to the line, "This feather stirs, she lives." Mr. Booth, whose Lear had many noble qualities of passion, plucked, I remember, some fur from his archaeologically incorrect ermine for the same business, but Salvini's was the finer effect of the two, as well as the truer, and those who saw Mr. Irving in the last act of Richard III have not, I am sure, forgotten how much the agony and terror of his dream was intensified by contrast, through the calm and quiet that preceded it, and the delivery of such lines as, "What, is my beaver easier than it was, and all my armor laid into my tent? Look that my staves be sound and not too heavy." Lines which had a double meaning for the audience, remembering that the last words which Richard's mother called after him as he was marching to Bosworth, "Therefore take with thee my most grievous curse, which in the day of battle tire thee more than all the complete armor that thou wearest." As regards the resources which Shakespeare had at his disposal, it is to be remarked that while he more than once complains of the smallness of the stage on which he has to produce big historical plays, and of the want of scenery which obliges him to cut out many effective open-air incidents, he always writes as a dramatist who had at his disposal a most elaborate theatrical wardrobe, and who could rely on the actors taking pains about their makeup. Even now it is difficult to produce such a play as the Comedy of Errors, and to the picturesque accident of Miss Ellen Terry's brother resembling herself, we owe the opportunity of seeing Twelfth Night adequately performed. Indeed, to put any play of Shakespeare's on this stage, absolutely as he himself wished it to be done, requires the services of a good property man, a clever wig maker, a costumier with a sense of color and a knowledge of textures, a master of the methods of making up, a fencing master, a dancing master, an artist, to direct personally the whole production. For he is most careful to tell us the dress and appearance of each character. "Voici d'abord la réalité," says Auguste Vacquerie somewhere. "Il ne daigne pas s'occuper de son costume si l'on s'en rapportait aux indications du poète. Agamemnon serait vêtu d'un sceptre et Achille d'une repère." I don't know. But with Shakespeare, it is very difficult. He gives us directions that costumes of Perdita, Florizel, Autolycus, the witches of Macbeth, and the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, several elaborate descriptions of his fat knight, and a detailed account of the extraordinary garb in which Petruchio is to be married. Rosaline, he tells us, is tall, and is to carry a spear and a little dagger. Celie is smaller, and is to paint her face brown so as to look sunburnt. The children who play at fairies in Windsor Forest are to be dressed in white and green, a compliment, by the way, to Queen Elizabeth, whose favorite colors they were, and in white with green garlands and gilded visors. The angels are to come to Catherine in Kimbleton. Bottom is in homespun. Lysander is distinguished from Oberon by his wearing an Athenian dress, and Launce has holes in his boots. The Duchess of Gloucester stands in a white sheet with her husband in mourning beside her. The motley of the fool, the scarlet of the cardinal, and the French lilies broidered on the English coats are all amid occasion for jest or taunt in the dialogue. We know the patterns on the Dauphin's armor, and the Pucel's sword, the crest on Warwick's helmet, and the color of Bardolph's nose. Portia has golden hair. Phoebe is black-haired. Orlando has chestnut curls, and Sir Andrew Ogcheek's hair hangs like flax on a distaff and won't curl at all. Some of the characters are stout, some lean, some straight, some hunchbacked, some fair, some dark, and some are too black in their faces. Lear has a white beard, Hamlet's father a grizzled, and Bendick is to shave his in the course of the play. Indeed, on the subject of stage beards, Shakespeare is quite elaborate, tells us of the many different colors in use, and gives a hint to actors always to see that their own are properly tied on. There is a dance of reapers in rye straw hats, and of rustics in hairy coats like satyrs, a mask of Amazons, a mask of Russians, and a classical mask, several immortal scenes over a weaver in an ass's head, a ride over the color of a coat which it takes the Lord Mayor of London to quell, and a scene between an infuriated husband and his wife's milliner about the slashing of his sleeve. As for the metaphors Shakespeare draws from dress and the aphorisms he makes on it, his hits at the costume of his age, particularly at the ridiculous size of ladies' bonnets, and the many descriptions of the mundus muliebri, the world of women. From the song of Autolycus in The Winter's Tale, down to the account of the Duchess of Milan's gown in Much Ado About Nothing. They are far too numerous to quote, though it may be worthwhile to remind people that the whole of the philosophy of clothes is to be found in Lear's scene with Edgar, passage which has the advantage of brevity and style over the grotesque wisdom and somewhat mouthing metaphysics of the Sartor Resartus. But I think that from what I have already said, it is quite clear that Shakespeare was very much interested in costume. I do not mean in that shallow sense by which it has been concluded from his knowledge of deeds and daffodils that he was the Blackstone and Paxton of the Elizabethan age, but that he saw that costume could be made at once impressive of a certain effect on the audience and expressive of a certain types of character, and is one of the essential factors of the means which a true illusionist has at his disposal. Indeed, to him the deformed figure of Richard was of as much value as Juliet's loveliness. He sets the serge of Radical beside the silks of the Lord, and sees the stage effects to be got from each. He has as much delight in Caliban as he has in Ariel, in rags as he has in cloth of gold, and recognizes the artistic beauty of ugliness. The difficulty Ducas felt about translating Othello in consequence of the importance given to such a vulgar thing as a handkerchief, and his attempt to soften its grossness by making the Moor reiterate "le bandeau, may be taken as an example of the difference between la tragédie philosophique, and the drama of real life, and the introduction for the first time of the word mouchoir at the Théâtre Français was an era in that romantic realistic movement of which Hugo is the father and M. Zola the enfant terrible, just as the classicism of the earlier part of the century was emphasized by Talma's refusal to play Greek heroes any longer in a powdered periwig, one of the many instances, by the way, of that desire for archaeological accuracy in dress which has distinguished the great actors of our age. In criticizing the importance given to money in La Comédie Humaine, Théophile Gautier says that Balzac may claim to have invented a new hero in fiction, le héros métallique. Of Shakespeare, it may be said that he was the first to see the dramatic value of doublets, and that a climax may depend on a crinoline. The burning of the Globe Theatre, an event due, by the way, to the results of the passion for illusion that distinguished Shakespeare's stage management, has unfortunately robbed us of many important documents, but in the inventory still in existence of the costume wardrobe of a London theatre in Shakespeare's time, there are mentioned particular costumes for cardinals, shepherds, kings, clowns, friars, and fools, green coats for Robin Hood's men, and a green gown for Maid Marian, a white and gold doublet for Henry V, and a robe for Longshanks, besides surplices, copes, damask gowns, gowns of cloth of gold and cloth of silver, taffeta gowns, calico gowns, velvet coats, satin coats, frieze coats, jerkins of yellow leather and of black leather, red suits, gray suits, French Perrault suits, a robe for Tougou Invisible, which seems inexpensive at 3.10 some European currency, I don't know, and 4 incomparable fardingales, all of which show a desire to give every character an appropriate dress. There are also entries of Spanish, Moorish, and Danish costumes, of helmets, lances, painted shields, imperial crowns, and papal tiaras, as well as costumes for Turkish janissaries, Roman senators, and all the gods and goddesses of Olympus, which evidence a good deal of archaeological research on the part of the manager of the theatre. It is true that there is a mention of a bodice for Eve, but probably the Danae of the play was after the fall. Indeed, anybody who cares to examine the age of Shakespeare will see that archaeology was one of its special characteristics. After that revival of the classical forms of architecture, which was one of the notes of the Renaissance, and the printing at Venice and elsewhere of the masterpieces of Greek and Latin literature, had come naturally an interest in the ornamentation and costume of the antique world. Nor was it for the learning that they could acquire, but rather for the loveliness that they might create, that the artists studied these things. The curious objects that were being constantly brought to light by excavations were not left to moulder in a museum, for the contemplation of a callous curator and the ennui of a policeman bored by the absence of crime. They were used as motives for the production of a new art, which was to be not beautiful merely, but also strange. Infusura tells us that in 1485, some workmen digging on the Appian Way came across an old Roman sarcophagus inscribed with the name Julia, daughter of Claudius. On opening the coffer, they found within its marble room the body of a beautiful girl of about 15 years of age, preserved by the embalmer's skill from corruption and the decay of time. Her eyes were half open, her hair rippled around her in crisp curling gold, and from her lips and cheek the bloom of maidenhood had not yet departed. Borne back to the capital, she became at once the center of a new cult, and from all parts of the city crowded pilgrims to worship at the wonderful shrine, till the Pope, fearing lest those who had found the secret of beauty in a pagan tomb might forget what secrets Judea's rough and rock-hewn sepulchre contained, had the body conveyed away by night, and in secret buried. Legend though it may be, yet the story is nonetheless valuable in showing us the attitude of the Renaissance toward the antique world. Archaeology to them was not a mere science for the antiquarian. It was a means by which they could touch the dry dust of antiquity into the very breath and beauty of life, and fill with the new wine of romanticism forms that else had been old and outworn. From the pulpit of Nicola Bassano down to Mantegna's Triumph of Caesar, and the service Cellini designed for King Francis, the influence of the spirit can be traced, nor was it confined merely to the immobile arts, the arts of arrested movement, but its influence was to be seen also in the great Greco-Roman masques, which were the constant amusement of the gay courts of the time, and in the public pomps and processions with which the citizens of big commercial towns were wont to greet the princes that chanced to visit them. Pageants, by the way, that were considered so important that large prints were made of them and published, a fact which is proof of the general interest at the time in matters of such kind. And this use of archaeology in shows, so far from being a bit of priggish pedantry, is in every way legitimate and beautiful. For the stage is not merely the meeting place of all the arts, but is also the return of art to life. Sometimes in an archaeological novel, the use of strange and obsolete terms seems to hide the reality beneath the learning, and I dare say that many of the readers of Notre-Dame de Paris have been much puzzled over the meaning of such expressions as la casque mawatre, les Vosgières, le Gallimard taché d'encre, les Caraciniers, and the like, but with the stage, how different it is. The ancient world wakes from its sleep, and history moves as a pageant before our eyes, without obliging us to have recourse to a dictionary or an encyclopedia for the perfection of our enjoyment. Indeed, there is not the slightest necessity that the public should know the authorities for the mounting of any piece. From such materials, for instance, as the disc of Theodosius, materials with which the majority of people are probably not very familiar, Mr. E. W. Godwin, one of the most artistic spirits of this century in England, created the marvelous loveliness of the first act of Claudian, and showed us the life of Byzantium in the 4th century, not by a dreary lecture instead of grimy casts, not by a novel which requires a glossary to explain it, but by the visible presentation before us of all the glory of that great town. And while the costumes were true to the smallest points of color and design, yet the details were not assigned to that abnormal importance which they must necessarily be given in a piecemeal lecture, but were subordinated to the rules of lofty composition and the unity of artistic effect. Mr. Symonds, speaking of that great picture of Mantegna's now in Hampton Court, says that the artist has converted an antiquarian motive into a theme for melodies of line. The same could have been said with equal justice of Mr. Godwin's scene. Only the foolish call it pedantry, only those who would neither look nor listen spoke of the passion of the play being killed by its paint. It was in reality a scene not merely perfect in its picturesqueness, but absolutely dramatic also, getting rid of any necessity for tedious descriptions, and showing us by the color and character of Claudian's dress, and the dress of his attendants, the whole nature and life of the man, from what school of philosophy he affected, down to what horses he backed on the turf. And indeed, archaeology is only really delightful when transfused into some form of art. I have no desire to underrate the services of laborious scholars, but I feel that the use Keats made of Lempriere's dictionary is of far more value to us than Professor Max Müller's treatment of the same mythology as a disease of language. Better endymion than any theory, however sound, or as in the present instance unsound, of an epidemic among adjectives. And what does not feel that the chief glory of Piranesi's book on vases is that it gave Keats the suggestion for his Ode to a Grecian Urn? Art and art only can make archaeology beautiful, and the theatric art can use it most directly and most vividly, for it can combine in one exquisite presentation the illusion of actual life with the wonder of the unreal world. But the 16th century was not merely the age of Vitruvius, it was the age of Vicello also. Every nation seems suddenly to have become interested in the dress of its neighbors. Europe began to investigate its own clothes, and the amount of books published on national costumes is quite extraordinary. At the beginning of the century, the Nuremberg Chronicle, with its 2,000 illustrations, reached its 5th edition. And before the century was over, 17 editions were published of Munster's Cosmography. Besides these 2 books, there were also the works of Michael Collins, of Hans Wiegel, of Amann, and of Vicello himself, all of them well illustrated, some of the drawings in Vicello being probably from the hand of Titian. Nor was it merely from books and treatises that they acquired their knowledge. The development of the habit of foreign travel, the increased commercial intercourse between countries, and the frequency of diplomatic missions gave every nation many opportunities of studying the various forms of contemporary dress. After the departure from England, for instance, of the ambassadors from the Tsar, the Sultan, and the Prince of Morocco, Henry VIII and his friends gave several masques in the strange attire of their visitors. Later on, London saw, perhaps far too often, the sombre splendor of the Spanish court, and to Elizabeth came envoys from all lands, whose dress, Shakespeare tells us, had an important influence on English costume. And the interest was not confined merely to classical dress, or the dress of foreign nations. There was also a good deal of research, amongst theatrical people especially, into the ancient costume of England itself, and when Shakespeare in the prologue to one of his plays expresses his regret at being unable to produce helmets of the period, he is speaking as an Elizabethan manager, and not merely as an Elizabethan poet. At Cambridge, for instance, during his day, a play of Richard III was performed, in which the actors were attired in real dresses of the time, procured from the great collection of historical costume in the Tower, which was always open to the inspection of managers, and sometimes placed at their disposal. And I cannot help thinking that this performance must have been far more artistic as regards costume than Garrick's mounting of Shakespeare's own play on the subject, in which he himself appeared in a nondescript fancy dress, and everybody else in the costume of the time of George III, Richmond especially being much admired in the uniform of a young guardsman. For what is the use to the stage of that archaeology which has so strangely terrified the critics, but that it and it alone can give us the architecture and apparel suitable to the time in which the action of the play passes? It enables us to see a Greek dressed like a Greek, and an Italian like an Italian, to enjoy the arcades of Venice and the balconies of Verona, and if the play deals with any of the great eras in our country's history, to contemplate the age in its proper attire, and the king in his habit as he lived. And I wonder, by the way, what Lord Lytton would have said some time ago at the Princess's Theatre, had the curtain risen on his father's Brutus, reclining in a Queen Anne chair, attired in a flowing wig and flowered dressing gown, a costume which in the last century was considered peculiarly appropriate to an antique Roman. For in those halcyon days of the drama, no archaeology troubled the stage or distressed the critics, and our inartistic grandfathers sat peaceably in a stifling atmosphere of anachronisms, and beheld with the calm complacency of the age of prose an Iachimo in powder and patches, a Lear in lace ruffles, and a Lady Macbeth in a large crinoline. I can understand archaeology being attacked on the ground of its excessive realism, but to attack it as pedantic seems to be very much beside the mark. However, to attack it for any reason is foolish. One might just as well speak disrespectfully of the equator. For archaeology, being a science, is neither good nor bad, but a fact simply. Its value depends entirely on how it is used, and only an artist can use it. We look to the archaeologist for the materials, to the artist for the method. In designing the scenery and costumes for any of Shakespeare's plays, the first thing the artist has to settle is the best date for the drama. This should be determined by the general spirit of the play, more than by any actual historical references which may occur in it. Most Hamlets I have seen were placed far too early. Hamlet is essentially a scholar of the revival of learning, and if the allusion to the recent invasion of England by the Danes puts it back to the 9th century, the use of foils brings it down much later. Once, however, that the date has been fixed, then the archaeologist is to supply us with the facts, which the artist is to convert into effect. It has been said that anachronisms in the plays themselves show us that Shakespeare was indifferent to historical accuracy, and a great deal of capital has been made out of Hector's indiscreet quotation from Aristotle. Upon the other hand, the anachronisms are really few in number and not very important, and had Shakespeare's attention been drawn to them by a brother artist, he would probably have corrected them. For though they can hardly be called blemishes, they are certainly not the great beauties of his work, or at least if they are, their anachronistic charm cannot be emphasized unless the play is accurately mounted according to its proper date.